folks. This is Eddie Carson, and you are listening to Race Matters with Eddie Carson here at WJOPLP Newburyport, Joppa Radio 96.3. Excited to be here in the house, and we're just going to have a conversation just for a little bit, particularly as we enter the month of January. This is around that time we start to see postings and this lineage of brother Dr. Martin, brother Dr. Reverend, make sure I get that right, Martin Luther King Jr., as we approach his day here in a couple weeks. Next month, in the month of February, is Black History Month, and so there'll be a number of things that'll transpire as we engage in those conversations too. In thinking about the show tonight and thinking about some of the things that Brother King professed and talked about, I started thinking about this notion of racism, particularly racism in the North and racism in the South. And I get asked that question quite a bit. And so this is going to be part one of a three-part series, which we're going to examine, which is a really large topic to try to cover. It's too much to cover in one show because I'm really, well, I don't want to keep you up at midnight, and you may tune me out by that particular point too, but I have a lot to say, plenty to say, and I think it's going to be really important as we think about these things in so many ways. You know, when I arrived to New England about a decade ago, I had a student in my class, and that student said, you know, did you ever fear about being a black man living in the American South? And it was an interesting conversation, and those topics came up a lot in my classes. I've taught courses on Black Christianity. I've taught courses on race, class, and gender. I've taught courses on African American thought and studies, and just a number of those things. And so we were always engaged and intrigued by the topics and the conversations that transpired. And so this student asked me the question, and it was a great question. We sat back, the entire class around a seminar table, and then I threw the question back out to students, and I asked them, well, what do you think? What do you think about this question, this conversation about race and racism between the North and the South? And no surprise, many students, they made points such as, well, it seems like it'd be a really scary place being a person of color, being a black man, being a black person, living in the American South. It just feels safer, more inviting, and more inclusive here in the North. At that point, I asked the question, why is that the case? Why do people believe that it's safer, it's better, it's quality of life is better for people who look like me, people who are African American, people who are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color living up here? And they went to that kind of old adage of bringing up different points, for example, and stop me if you've heard this before, because I think this is going to sound very familiar. It was the North that fought the Civil War and fought on behalf of really emancipating and freeing blacks. It was the North that didn't really have racism the same way that the former Confederate states engaged and embraced in acts of racism. It seems such a much more, I guess today, right, blue, democratic, maybe more progressive environment than what once existed. Yeah, so those are some of the things that came out. My students, being young, mentioned things such as, and it's not even an age thing. I mean, I mentioned, for example, on the last show that when I was talking about, what does it mean to be white in white spaces, right? That I found myself in a conversation with a couple middle-aged white guys. And they were unfamiliar, for example, with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65. They had never heard, nor did they understand the word Jim Crow. And those things caught me by surprise too. So I'm saying that to say that it's not an age thing whatsoever, particularly for the fact that I'm over my years, I've been blessed and fortunate to teach extremely bright and gifted students. But yet, in this conversation that we're having, students really got to a particular point where they were wrestling with this idea of just this notion of feeling freer, things being more alive, safer for people who look like me up here. And we delved into that a little bit, and really we got to a point where, every year, particularly in the type of courses and the conversations that I engage with young folks in, I really made this the center of our discussions because I thought, they'd been misled. I think most people, regardless of your age, regardless of your educational status, your economic status, or where you're from, that people who have been misled to think that the North is just this safer environment. And again, that's a conversation we're going to have, a little bit today, a little bit the next 2 episodes, especially based off the merits. I want to go ahead and start off by making sure folks know, if you don't know, that I'm a black man who was raised in the American South, Montgomery, Alabama. I lived in Little Rock, Arkansas, Searcy, Arkansas. I've lived in Texas, albeit, right, still some scary aspects of Texas, but probably in a little bit more, diverse cities such as Houston. So my entire way of thought and being has really centered around living in the South. And so I want to take you to an interesting conversation I had as I was really about to leave Texas to accept an appointment at an institution here in Massachusetts where I was going to teach some great courses in a history department. While packing and getting ready to relocate, to move from Texas to Massachusetts, I was at a Goodwill. And I was taking a lot of goods there that I was looking to donate, right? That's what you do when you move, when you relocate. You start to rethink, what do you want to carry with you? What do you not want to carry with you? So my wife and I were at Goodwill. And while there, talking to this brother, this just chilled and mellow black brother who was taking our stuff, and he asked me the question, where are y'all moving to? What's going on? So we engaged him in a conversation. I said, well, we're headed to North Andover, Massachusetts. It's about, 20 miles north of Boston, in a wonderful state of Massachusetts. And his brother turned to us and he said, wow, why would you move to Massachusetts? Why would you move to that greater Boston area? Don't you know those people up there are about as racist as they come? Now, I delved and I poked and asked him a little more questions about all the places he's lived. And one of the things that he stated is, well, I've lived in the Deep South my whole life, but I would never live in New England. Particularly, I would never live in the greater Boston area. I would never live in Massachusetts just because the people up there are super racist people. That's a gross generalization, right? One of the things that I tell folks back down south, and the thing that I tell folks up here, is that racism is ubiquitous. It exists everywhere, and it really hides and manifests itself in different ways. And so we don't want to get into those generalizations about what area is the most racist area. You can Google online, for example. I did this. The most racist places to live. And no surprise, the area popped up. But yet, that's not to say it's the most racist area, the most racist place on the planet. Because again, racism is ubiquitous, right? It navigates in a lot of arenas and a lot of areas. So having that conversation with him was interesting because when I turned to my white brothers and sisters in the Deep South, and they knew, of course, about our sojourn up here to Massachusetts, one of the things that they told me was, Oh, brother Carson, you're moving up to Massachusetts. That place is super progressive and super liberal, and you're gonna like it. You're gonna fit in with your politics and the things you think about all the time. And that the parallelism, right, was quite interesting in the sense that on one hand, down the racial line, in this binary sense, one person is sitting there saying it's the scariest place on the planet, though they never lived there, never been here, never spent any time. And then I'm talking to, on the other side of the color line, white folks down south who are telling me that you are going to be in paradise. You're going to be able to walk the streets. You're going to be able to navigate in so many ways. You're going to be in wonderful shape. You're not going to be able to have to worry nor ponder nor think about some of the things that may scare you living in the deep south. And there's some interesting elements to that, which as we move forward through this 3-part series, we're going to explore a little bit more. When we think about this notion of race and racism here, right? I think we have to understand that race is it's a human invention. It's a human invention. I think the shorthand term used to describe and categorize people into various social groups based off various different characteristics. For example, I like my hair. I got that woolly hair, right? It's not straight like some other folks, right? So that's a characteristic. Some folks like to get into other distinctive characteristics about race, particularly when it comes to lip size, nose size, and they really get into some interesting things that are really based off white supremacist tropes. But some of the other characteristics are beyond, these physical features that I think in some ways are imaginary, are things such as the obvious, such as my skin complexion. I am black. Are there people who are darker than I am? Absolutely. Are there folks who are lighter than I am? Absolutely. Are there black folks who are light enough that they can pass as white? Another topic or another conversation that'll come in, right? We know about some of the hereditary features that define people such as myself. Race, well, and I think this is important for us to keep in mind, race is not a valid biological concept, right? A lot of the biological aspects of race have been disproven, particularly as we've navigated more into the 20th and into the 21st century. Is a real social construction that gives or denies the benefits and privileges for different folks when we think about the color line that exists there. American society particularly, and just to keep in mind, right, when we define and we think about aspects of race, those things are different in different parts of the globe. And some people think about race differently. You go to some countries on the continent of Africa, for example, they may see themselves as being Nigerian, but not black, right? Because black people frame the absolute and the whole existence of everybody who is there. American society developed the notion of race early in its formation to justify its new economic system, such as capitalism, that came into place. We moved from a position where, as Europeans migrated over, they used white folks as labor, economic labor. We already know the American Revolutionary War was a war in order to subscribe to the victory of capitalism as it trumped mercantilism. Right? That's a part and an aspect we do know that's here. But yet, one of the greatest fears, of course, historically in this country is the fact that as white indentured laborers and black folks start to realize their common struggles, that became a concern. Historian Gerald Horne, we put out a book together a couple years ago, and Gerald writes a lot about this, and email me, happy to have a conversation, give you some wonderful links and resources to that. But Gerald really does a nice job talking about this notion of the best way to protect systems and to really hold on to elements of white supremacy is to make sure that this interracial dynamics between black and white folks does not continue to happen. And capitalism has played a major role in that historically, particularly when we get to the year 1619 and we start to see the migration of black folks from Barbados into the United States to be used as slave labor, forced labor, the enslaved that really took place here too. To more accurately understand how race and its counterpart, racism, are woven into the very fabric of this particular country here, I mean, we can't dismiss elements of white privilege, anti-blackness. And what does that mean? In both white privilege and anti-blackness is going to really frame a lot in terms of what we're going to talk about when we think about racism in the North and racism in the South. Similarly, right, when we think about earlier decades, the category of white expanded and in some ways even contracted during the early 20th century to include various groups of people such as the Italians from Eastern Europe. I've mentioned this before on this show, that one of the reasons why many Italians love Columbus Day as a holiday, and I understand, right? You know, it's a celebration of their identity and their culture, but it's also seen by many, particularly our indigenous brothers, sisters, and non-binary folks, as exploitive and oppressive, is the fact that by the time we get to the year 1947, Italians are now going to be considered white in the United States. And that really starts to change things quite a bit. And they become embraced in different ways than, to say, the Chinese out in the western part of the United States, indigenous folks, particularly black people, right? Black folks, indigenous folks, Chinese. We already know, of course, what's going to happen to the Japanese during World War II. These groups of people are never fully going to be incorporated into the narrative of American identity and culture here in this country, much like the Italians did. And so when we think about the notion of whiteness, as a result, those folks would struggle to gain the same privileges that white people were afforded, or and still are afforded. You know, things such as voting. We're going to have to campaign and fight for those things. Education, citizenship, and a share in the nation's wealth. Talked a lot about that on the last episode dealing with privilege. A lot of those things really start to really come to fruition. And so as we start with this basis and we think about this element of racism in the North and racism in the South and what place makes one feel safer, I think it really becomes an aspect of stylistic aspects in defining these things. You know, so for example, the differences really are more stylistic than anything there. You know, here in the North, there's a sense, and then I think, right, and I feel pretty confident in this. I welcome folks to reach out if you'd like to have a conversation or there's some disagreement on this. But when we think about this in a stylistic way, as we think to the North, people being less comfortable with just being around people of color. Let's start there as the first point. I go back to the beginning of this episode and that conversation I was having with people around the seminar table. One of the things that I was telling my students is the fact that growing up in the Deep South, racism was explicit. It existed. And it operated in so many ways. The Confederate flag being everywhere, really just seeing, you know, what oftentimes felt like this out hostility from white supremacist groups. But that's not to say that doesn't exist here in the North. Because see, the other thing to keep in mind dealing with issues of the South is this. I walk down the street in the South and I'm just another person. I walk down the street, particularly in white communities up here in the North, and there's just something that's very different that stands out that really invites this conversation in the minds of people that is he in the right neighborhood? Does he belong here? This thing about interracialness and togetherness among black and white folks. Again, just sticking to the racial binary. We know race goes beyond the racial binary. One of the things that we hear and we see is the fact that interracialness, groups, couples, relationships, all those things, deep down south, are really quite normal, average. A lot of folks, right, were grown and raised and engaged in segregated communities, but yet seeing folks who did not look like them was not unusual. In many ways, particularly here in Massachusetts, but in New England, that is the case. Seeing someone that is just not like them, a white person, that's an adjustment. And oftentimes, right, that uncomfortability around people of a different color is really driven by those things. Their ideas may be more politically correct, and I'm talking about Northerners, right? Their ideas about race are much more politically correct than, say, the politics of Southerners, where Southerners engage in ways that really seems frightening, alarming, and scary. And I think one of the things that we probably should keep in mind, too, is that black people in the South, over a period of time, right? Because my parents grew up in the South, or particularly my mom. I was raised in the South. You become used to what I would call the normality of existence that's there. And so those things are there. So when we think about these racialized inequities, those things take on different dimensions when we think about the differences between the North and the South. You know, we start off by thinking about things such as schools. In the South, I'll tell you this story. When I was in junior high school, we had what was called a rules and laws called minority to majority. And minority to majority rules meant that if I lived in a predominantly black community and I wanted to transfer or go to a different public school, which, just full transparency, I attended a white independent private school by the time I got to high school. One of the things that meant was that the only school I could transfer to is a school that was majority white. And if you were a white person who wanted to transfer, you could only transfer in terms of the public schools to a school that was predominantly made up of people who were not white. I hate the word minority. It weakens us in so many ways. But the program was called Minority to Majority School. And a lot of that really was framed around busing and what that meant in terms of busing white folks into different areas and black folks in a different area to really try to increase aspects and elements of desegregation that's starting to happen and that's transpiring too. So those became the issue. Housing segregation drives a lot of that. You know, one of the things that we know over the historical landscape is the fact that in the South, as many black people work to really elevate themselves to a status of middle class, you start to see some black people moving into a fair number of white neighborhoods and white communities, but yet not many, because that becomes problematic. That existed in the South, but it was also an issue here in the North. I will say, you will find more communities that are more integrated, some suburban areas, depending on your economic status, right? Let's keep that in mind. Then you're going to find here in the North. You know, there's a great demographic chart I recall looking at years ago when I was in the city of Memphis, Tennessee, and it really outlined all the major urban areas in the United States. And it illustrated the fact that here in the 21st century, segregation is still alive and exists in so many ways. You know, I go back to that seminar table when I ask my students, why do you think, for example, that racism in the South is worse than racism in the North? And one of the things they brought up, of course, were the radical abolitionists, going back to Abraham Lincoln and going back to elements of slavery even, talking about how the radical abolitionists were motivated to join the Union Army, to fight, to abolish slavery in the U.S., particularly, this was driven by many white Americans living in this country who fought on behalf of the Union during the Civil War. But yet, we have to keep in mind, too, that many of those Union soldiers were not engaged in this. And I may get some pushbacks and disagreements. Hey, that is okay, right? Happy to cite and have a conversation with folks. But folks didn't engage in the Civil War, particularly white Union people, to free slaves. That didn't happen whatsoever. Many would say that many of those Unionists were just as racist as Southerners. I would contend, though, right, and I'm going to take a little bit a less pessimistic view on this and a more hopeful view as I like to look at this, particularly seeing the number of white folks who did die, is the fact that I do believe that the American Civil War was fought to end slavery. Absolutely. And I do think, you're right, white folks engaged in this conflict to end slavery because the Civil War was fought to end slavery, to emancipate black folks. And while that took place and while that transpired, that doesn't mean white folks in the Union coming up from the great New England states were any less racist than Southerners were. You know, most Northern white Americans harbored a deep racist view towards black folks. And they did not want to have black folks permanently, or even temporarily, not even permanently, but even temporarily residing in their states or in their neighborhoods or their communities. You know, we continue to see this, particularly by the time we get to the busing crisis and issues dealing with desegregation in the 1970s. You have white flight that's going to take place. People worried about issues of busing, and you're going to start seeing, not going to name any towns here. I think if you Google and play around with some of the communities, especially as you move closer toward the North Shore of Massachusetts, a lot of those towns were created primarily as an aspect of white flight. And that's one of the things that we're going to see framed, right? So those elements are going to be here. And those things are true. You know, indeed, you know, black folks in most northern states were commonly denied basic civil rights and were formally subjected to a multitude of restrictions in terms of places they can enter, places they couldn't. While there may not have been any formalization of Jim Crow in the North, Jim Crow did exist in the North from a historical lens. Those restrictions really haunted and daunted the everyday reality of black folks up north, where you're going to see in terms of some of the comparable restrictions of civil rights and freedoms of folks in the South. Yeah, I want to share this story with you, and I think it's a fascinating story. I'm going to save my story dealing with James Reeb, the great UU minister, and someone I've mentioned on this show before, wonderful white brother who went down to the South to march along with Brother King and who died for the souls of black folks. In doing so, I want to tell you about this brother named Edward Brooke. You know, Edward Brooke, folks like him, the North was kind of this hope, this sense of promise that was there. Things will be better. When I was a kid, I'll never forget, when I was in the 5th grade, I always assumed that racism was a Southern issue. And I was watching something on television when I was in 5th grade that was talking about the busing situation in Boston. It was in the 5th grade that it really dawned on me intellectually that racism existed in the North as it did in the South. And I didn't fully have that comprehension because when I was a kid, I thought it was just a Southern thing. And it was something I thought about immensely because intellectually, I just didn't have the vocabulary nor the full knowledge to grasp it, though I knew what it looked like and it scared me in so many ways. So going back to this brother, Edward Brooke, who had this sense that he wanted to be in the North and his drive to the North because the North was different. Brooke first set foot in New England during World War II. When his Army regiment trained in Massachusetts, it got him to a place where he felt like this is going to be a different kind of place. You know, he was not a deeply Southern person being a native of Washington, D.C., but we do know that Jim Crow did exist in Washington, D.C., and it was there. It really encapsulated that city. It's why, in many ways, you have historically a lot of different types of issues that are there, but you also have, a very large African American black population. When World War II came to an end, Edward Brooke decided, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and move up to Boston. And he decided that he was going to enroll in law school. When he moved up to Boston, he voted for the first time. Keep in mind, right? A lot of voting restrictions in the South that were problematic. And so we're kind of seeing some of the ways in which he engaged in the freedoms that places like Massachusetts allotted for him. And so that happened for the first time in his life after the end of the Second War. And he did much more too, He was elected to the state attorney general's office in the year 1962, right? So now we're in the 1960s. Kind of think about what's happening in this country and what's happening in the Deep South. By 1966, he won an election to the U.S. Senate. Think about that. A black man in the U.S. Senate. Brooke achieved all of this in a state that was 97% white. And so people would argue that racism is definitely not comparable, nor is racism the same in Massachusetts as it is in the Deep South, for the fact that you have this brother named Edward Brooke who never voted till he came up to Massachusetts. He was elected to the Attorney General's office, became a U.S. Senator. He engaged because he really wanted that sense of migration here and to really enjoy the freedoms that he had been denied in the Jim Crow South. What constituted a political reality in Massachusetts, an African American can, win 1 million white votes, was the stuff of hallucinations in many ways when you think about the Mason-Dixon line and you go below that Mason-Dixon line down to the Deep South, as we think. At the same time, an open secret haunted the northern states, though, right? So you got Edward Brooks who's doing these things. And these are the things that northern white folks, which is a little different from southern white folks, they like to pat themselves on the back and say, see, we're from the state where the Kennedys come from. We're super liberal, we're progressive. Let me remind you that John F. Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy, right, denied black folks entry into the White House to certain functions, particularly if they were engaged in an interracial marriage or an interracial relationship. Worried about the optics of what that might look like too. So if we think about Edward Brooks in the North, let's take that in comparison to the South. As the nation gazed at Southern whites' resistance to civil rights, we saw the dogs and the cattle prods, and you saw the bombings, particularly in 1963 with the 16th Street Baptist Church. Everyone was just overwhelmed with this notion of white racial terrorism that existed. And I think that is something to keep in mind too, because while you had racism in different ways in New England, that white racial terrorism that existed in the Deep South was quite different, and it was framed. Northerners told themselves, right, watching the TV screen, watching the dogs attack people, watching Bull Connor saying the blacks and the whites must be segregated, watching Governor George Wallace of Alabama, who talked about, and I'm going to misquote him, segregation today, segregation tomorrow. I think he said segregation forever, for example. By the way, I do want to say that George Wallace did speak in Byfield back in the 1960s. So I thought that was a fascinating point I learned really in the past, this past year. That's there. And so you have Northerners who are like feeling good about themselves, looking at the horrific notions that were taking place in the South, patting themselves on the back. Northerners told themselves that such scenes emanated from a backward land, heathens, unsophisticated folks on backwards land, a dying region of the country, a place apart from the intellectuals of Harvard and Yale and, I don't know, Dartmouth and University of Massachusetts and I don't know. We can go on and name all kind of colleges, University of Rhode Island, and we can go on and on and on, right? Those things didn't exist here because we were educated, we were trained folks. We traveled, we were cultured, we had art, we had sophistication that was there. Yet, rampant segregation in cities across the country, but particularly in New England, rendered racial inequality a national trait more than in southern areas. And I think that national trait is something we've got to keep in mind. When black migrants steamed, in a way, north during the post-World War II period, folks like James Baldwin, a brother who I deeply have a long and intellectual love relationship for, reflected by noting that they do not escape Jim Crow by leaving the South. They merely encounter another, less direct form of Jim Crow. And it was, in many ways, he would say, quite deadly in its variety. All right, so kind of paraphrasing what that brother once said. They moved not to New York, but to Harlem, where black folks congregated in that area that seemed safer. Not to Chicago, but to the South Side. Not to Boston, but Lower Roxbury. And I understand Roxbury is a part of Boston and everything too, so I'm not going to get into the geographical elements just yet. You know, it reflects the fact, again, that the idea among a lot of Northerners that racism is a pervasive problem in the South is a pervasive problem in a very different way than exists in the North. You know, the sense, or their sense, of innocence and smugness, as though race is not an issue in the North, but race is an issue in the South. And that element of race in these different areas really compound the complexities that exist. So, as we're sitting here and listening to Race Matters here at WJOPLP Newburyport, Joppa Radio 96.3, the question we have to ask ourselves here is, so what? What's the solution? What's the conclusion? All right? I'm someone who knew racism existed in the North and knew it was different from racism in the South. What do we do about that? And I think as we continue to engage in this series, as I go from this kind of macro to a micro aspect of really thinking about this, particularly as I bring in some of the human narratives and elements, and a lot of them I'm going to pull strictly from my mother's experience. There's a great episode. That wonderful soul sister was on this show talking about what it meant to be a black woman growing up in the Jim Crow South from my own experience, right? Even some of the shared experience from white folks. I think there are going to be some interesting takeaways as we think about how white people have come to take New England for granted, how they have come to make assumptions about the fact that racism is not an element here and we can ignore it. A term I've used on this show before that people buy into is this notion of colorblind ideology, which is super dangerous. It's part of that genteel, that polite politics that drives it. So what does this mean as we move forward, as we wrestle with solutions, as I deliver content to you, and you ask, but what do I do with this information? You know, the conversations we really need to be having are the tough conversations that no one wants to have at all. You know, we need to look at these structural issues as one, and what structural racism looks like, and what does it mean, and how structural racism is the thing that is putting Massachusetts and New England into a underdeveloped status of less democratic than it should be. And I can hear people saying, whoa, man, that's kind of strong, Eddie. Hey, dial it back just a little bit. Just giving you something to chew on, something to think about. You know, I think we have to look at our education system. How is it serving people? I get it. I'm a dean at an elite school. I'm blessed with privileges, you know, working at an elite institution, teaching a population of folks that come from less than 1% of the general population, right? So I'm aware of their privileges, but I'm also aware of my privileges too. And so the framing becomes, well, how do we engage in these systems of education and thinking about race? When you operate in communities or a community that's elite, and I do benefit from that. I do. And I'm blessed. I won't deny that. Doesn't mean we can't have that conversation. And what does that mean? I think we have to look at what's happening in thinking about criminal justice and the economics of New England and throughout this country as we wrestle with this. I think we have to do that rather than focusing on much of these relatively, what I would call superficial ideas that people get caught up on about not addressing the issues. Some people call that critical race theory. But how do we teach and engage and use this to develop a citizenry that's going to expand policies that are there? That's why we read books. Hopefully that's why you listen to this show. That's why I give the lectures and write and do all the things that I do, because if not me, then who? And that seems, I know, a bit arrogant, and I'm not being arrogant. I'm just being a truth teller. All right, those are the things we have to do. I think we have to think about our personal attitudes towards one another. And what does that mean? And how do we engage in interracial connections that could change our hearts and our souls and bring about some of the aspects and the dimensions that are needed too? I think those are some of the solutions, right? And those things are really at the macro level. You know, as we continue to talk about this, it really is my hope that I'll give you some information that'll touch your soul, your mind, and your heart in a way where you'll say, yes, I want to do this. But yet, I think the challenge for white New England liberals is the fact that, going back to what I've been saying, New Englanders already see themselves, particularly some folks, not all folks in Massachusetts, right? They see themselves as being, you know, not a cog in a white supremacist world, kind of operating a sentiment that's disingenuous to social progress and the plight of all folks. But I think Massachusetts folks, New Englanders, see themselves as, but Eddie, I'm already here. I'm on your side. I'm already doing those things. Let me give you my track record of everything that's happening. And we sit down and we have a conversation, and I say, well, I don't know. You know, I appreciate what you're saying, but there's some challenges here. And the next thing I know, I've offended someone. They're like, well, you know, I was trying, but you just derailed that, and I guess I'm just going to, right, feel derailed in my efforts. And that's not what I'm looking to see happen or transpire. I'm looking just to push. And that's what I do. I poke and I push and I poke and I push. In all circles. Because I do believe, not just talking about it, because I live the life and I do it and I'm in the streets and I make sure those things happen. I get tired of hearing people just talk about it. And most people are really good at talking about it. Oftentimes, that's why I find myself alone, doing it by myself. And my cell phone right here. And I oftentimes tell people, you know, how many folks can I dial if I really need them to show up for us to combat injustices? And the reality, of course, is we're really talking about a very few. And we need to expand that lens because, as I mentioned at the beginning, this discomfort is what drives that. And for New Englanders particularly, discomfort around the othering drives that. Whereas the explicit nature of problems dealing with race and racism in the South are grossly grotesque and problematic. And again, something we'll delve into a little bit deeper as we move into the funk of thinking about these issues. Thanks for listening to Eddie Carson, folks, here at Race Matters. I'm glad that you tuned in. You're listening to Race Matters at WJOPLP Newburyport, Joppa Radio 96.3. Hope you have a good evening. Hope you'll chime in as we continue to do more of this stuff. And I hope you will use your social media platform to promote the show, promote radical love, to promote social justice, to engage in further conversations, and not just to further the, how do we put it? Sanitizing and deodorizing of Martin Luther King in the month of January. because that happens all too often. Take care, folks. Thanks for listening.